Hey everyone, Miss Ruby here with another art lesson from the garden. Today we're going to be working on ceramics hand building, and we're going to be looking at a red-tailed hawk or a Cooper hawk or any kind of bird you like. So in your kit you received some slabs of clay, blocks of clay. I'll put those aside for right now. You also received a plastic mat to protect the working surface with some tools in it. Okay, so you're going to unroll your supplies, and we're going to use this Cooper hawk photo for a reference to get some information about what a bird looks like. And kind of like we've done in the past, we're going to think about the big parts first and try to break this down and simplify it. So here I have the different parts of the bird kind of broken down. So I see what the shape of the body looks like, kind of like a long oval or kind of a football shape. And the head just kind of extends out of the body and doesn't really have its own shape. Then I see the wings are big, almost triangular shapes. And then the tail is kind of a triangular shape. So I'm going to look at my clay slabs and try to figure out which pieces would lend themselves to which parts of the bird. So I kind of cut these in a way so that you could think about this biggest piece as the body, and then these kind of flatter pieces as the wings. And this is an extra piece for different things you might want to add later. So I'm going to pull the shape of the tail out of this block that's going to be the body. But so first of all, this clay comes from the ground. We're working with low fire ceramic gray clay that needs to be fired in the kiln. After it's fired in the kiln, it comes back and it's hardened and all white after it gets the moisture sucked out. So it's really important as we're working that we put our pieces together in a way that they'll be really strong and they'll survive a trip to the kiln. We also want to put our pieces of clay together in a way that we're not wasting a lot of clay. So I'm going to start out with the biggest block of clay, thinking about the biggest part of the animal or the part that everything is attached to. So the body is a big central part that the other parts are attached to. So looking at this block, I might turn it and figure out, okay, which way makes the most sense? I kind of think this long way looks most like the body. But this is a rectangular piece, or almost like a cube, that has corners and hard edges. This body doesn't have corners or hard edges. So I want to start off using the palms of my hand, the biggest part of my hand, and I'm just tapping and really gently changing the shape. I'm going to tap away the corners, kind of softening the shape, making it a little bit more rounded. So you notice I'm not really using my fingers yet. If I use my fingers at the beginning, I end up with these little crumb pieces of clay, and those can't be used right now. They're not going to be strong. Remember, we're trying to build this so it's really strong. So I'm kind of, tapping and changing the shape, trying to make it into the shape that I want to see. So I'm looking for kind of this football shape, and then I'm going to get that triangular shape to come out of the end. Okay, so I'm tapping, and I'm making small changes, small adjustments. Here I'm kind of tapping and pinching where I want to find this part, where the tail starts to kind of flare out. I could also kind of pinch and pull out the shape of the tail. Okay. What I really don't want to do is flatten the clay. This is a 3D sculpture, so I want it to be, seen from all different directions, and I don't want it to be flat. This is 2D, this is going to be 3D. So you see I'm just making small changes and adjustments. I'm starting to find where the head is going to be. I'm kind of going around, I'm turning my clay as I'm working, trying to think about all the different sides. Okay, it's starting to feel a little bit like the shape of the bird here. And so I noticed that the beak kind of comes out of the head. It kind of, I can kind of pinch and pull to get the shape of the beak to come out. I could also later on cut a piece of clay from this extra piece and add on a beak if I wanted to. But this is kind of a small beak that hooks and comes out of the shape of the head. So what I really want to be careful not to do is to pinch too much, because what happens here is my clay becomes too thin and too brittle and it will break off. And then again, I have kind of one of these crumb pieces that I can't use. So when you're pinching your clay, you want to be careful about the space between your fingers. I'm never pinching all the way down because my clay will become far too thin. As you're working, you want to think about things being strong and not too thin. So if I pinch all the way down, it becomes super thin and it's really brittle. But I also don't want it to be too thick. So I'm kind of tapping this part down, trying to thin it down a little bit too. So as I'm working on the tail, again, I always want the clay to be at least as thick as my thumb. If it's thinner than my thumb, like this is really thin, it can break. So that's our general rule, is that we want it to be thicker than our thumb. So this is really skinny. I have to be a little bit more careful about that, make it a little bit thicker. So you see, as I'm pushing my fingers over the shape of the head, that clay moves to where the beak is going to be. And I don't want to forget about this side. Remember, it's a 3D sculpture, so I'm turning it around and figuring out what all sides of this are going to look like. And I can kind of tap so it doesn't become too thin. So I'm starting to see the shape of the head, starting to see the shape of the tail, and I can decide, do I want it to be in flight? Do I want it to be standing? So I can kind of change the angle based on how I want this to be. This piece that I just molded is kind of in flight. So I made it with its wings out. If I wanted it to be a standing bird, I might kind of tap and pull up so that it's pointing as if it were standing up. And I can think about, do I want the wings to be tucked in? Do I want them to be in flight? In this picture, the wings are open and in flight. So I'm kind of working off of that information. So I'm going to think about how to make my wings. So this big block at this point doesn't really look like a wing. So I need to think about how I want to change the shape. I notice that this kind of has a curve here and kind of a flat line here. So I can work with that. Flatten this part out, kind of pinching and pulling to change the shape, trying to make it look more like what I see here. I can also put my hands into the shape that I want it to be. So I see this is more pointed, so I can kind of tap or smush with the palms of my hands like that. And that changes the shape too. And always remember, we're making slow, gentle changes, not drastic changes. Okay, so I'm looking for the general shape of the wing. It doesn't have to be perfect because as I add details, it's going to change anyway. But so now I need to think about how I'm going to attach this piece to this piece. So if I just stick this like this, it's just going to fall right off. If I attach this piece, it's a smooth thing attaching to a smooth thing, so it doesn't want to hold on. So in our next part, I'll show you guys how we're going to attach things, but first you guys can focus on creating all of your shapes and getting those ready to attach. All right, you guys, so we're ready for part 2. So I've molded the shape of the body, kind of pulled the tail out of there, pulled the beak out of the shape of the head, and I've molded and changed the shapes of the wings to get those ready to attach. So you notice that I didn't use any tools other than my hands yet, but now we're going to need to look at the tools we have. So I've got a fork, I've got a knife for cutting the clay, and I've got some tools to add details, and I've got a nice clay tool for smoothing my attachments. I also have a cup of slip here. Slip is very watered down clay that's going to act as our glue. But you'll see this is in its dry state right now. It's just little old chunks of clay. So I need to activate this by adding just a little bit of water. Okay, and if I give that a minute, it will eventually turn to very watery slip, and it's going to work like glue. So I'm going to set that aside for a minute. So when we're attaching our clay pieces, again, our goal is to make them strong and to make sure that they're going to stay together. If I stick this like this, it's just going to fall right off. So I want to think about the attachment. Smooth thing next to smooth thing like this pulls apart really easily. What I want to do is have one side grab the other side and really hold on tight. So what I need to do is score, which is scratching, score the clay, add slip, which works like glue, little dabs of slip, score, slip on both sides, and smooth. So anytime we attach anything with our clay, we have to score, slip, and smooth. So the scoring creates almost like Velcro with the clay, and they will grab the other side. So we have to do that on both sides. The slip works like glue, and the smoothing makes sure that this piece becomes one with the other piece and that it won't come off. I have to make sure to do this on both sides, because if I only do my smoothing on one side, this could still fall off. It has not been bonded yet. So it's really helpful to take a tool like this and to take some material from the wing and drag that onto the body. This is helping these two pieces to really fuse and become really strong. And now when I wiggle this, it's not going to move too much, and that's how I know that it's not going to break off. Okay, so this is really strongly attached. It's not going to wiggle, it's not going to fall off. My wing is also a little bit thicker than an actual bird wing might be, but if I were to make it as thin as a feather, it will break. So I need to make sure that it's at least as thick as my finger. Okay, at least as thick as my finger. So anytime we attach pieces, even if they're tiny pieces, we have to make sure we use our scoring, slip, and smoothing technique. So I'll show you that again one more time. So scoring means scratching the clay. And I've found a fork is a really good tool for this because it makes 4 marks. So we're scoring both sides so it will work like Velcro. Scoring. And then I'm going to get my slip here. You can use your finger for this, or you can use a tool. One thing we want to make sure we don't do, I don't want to smooth this out as I add my slip because that's defeating the purpose. So I score, and then I can use my tool and just kind of dab a little bit of that slip on both sides. And then I'm going to use my fingers to smooth these pieces together, or I could use my tool to smooth. You have to be really careful that you do this all the way around, otherwise this wing will just fall off. So making sure we're smoothing both sides. Okay. And you see, I didn't make my wings absolutely perfect because they're going to get a little roughed up as I'm attaching. So as I go back, now I can really start thinking about making them beautiful and making them more how I want them to look. Okay, so I'm kind of figuring out how I want those to be. So anytime you attach something, we've got to follow that scoring, slip, and smoothing. So for example, if you wanted to do a bird with a little bit of a bigger beak, like a crow or something like that, you could take a cut piece, a nice fresh cut piece of clay, and you can get rid of this guy's beak for now. You can score, slip, slip, and smooth those pieces together. All the way around. So one thing about the slip, people kind of like to use a lot of it because it's fun, it feels kind of like mud to play with, but you don't want to use too much slip because it's really mushy and your clay piece won't hold its form. It will start to just melt or become really mushy. So a little bit of this slip goes a long way. If you start to see places in your clay that are drying out, you could take a tiny bit of this slip and smooth out any cracks that start to look like the desert. All right, so once you get all of your different parts attached, it's time to start thinking about finishing up and adding detail. So I have my wings attached here, and I attached a beak. And if you wanted to make the beak open, you can use your knife and make the clay piece eat the tool. And then you can kind of open it up and have your bird singing. You want to be careful though that this doesn't get too thin. My beak is a little bit thin, so I can kind of tap, 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 tap gently on this until it thickens up a little bit. So it's not too thin and there won't be danger of it breaking. This kind of clay work is really delicate and really fragile, and it breaks really easily. So think about how your clay piece has to travel to the kiln and make sure that it's going to be strong enough to survive the trip. So as you're working, you may need to prop pieces up. So like I wanted my wings to look like they're flying. So I am going to stick a little bit of paper towel or recycled newspaper or something underneath those so that it will hold that in its shape and it can dry in its shape. So I'm just going through, and anywhere that I see a crack means that it's not strong. So I need to really smooth over those parts and make sure that everything is going to stay strong, and then I can prop it up with a little bit of newspaper. So when I'm looking at this picture, I notice that the ends of the wings have some really beautiful details in the feathers. Let's take a look at this. So I noticed that there are negative spaces or kind of cutouts in between those feathers, so I can work on that. I also noticed that there's a lot of detail. There are like these beautiful stripes all over the feathers, little marks on the feathers on the body. His eye is really beautiful and important. So these are parts that I want to think about as I'm getting closer to being completed with the project. Okay, so if I wanted to create those feathers, I can draw them on like this. I may even be able to do some cuts to create negative spaces, cut those pieces out. But remember that any piece that you have has to be thicker than your thumb. So even though this bird's feathers might be really thin, I have to go thicker than I see in my photo. So I'm just cutting these pieces and setting them aside, and these are pieces that are large enough that if I wanted to add something on, like feathers on the back or something like that, I can use these extra pieces. So I'm keeping those aside. They're not like those little crumbly crumbs that I don't want to use. These are pieces that could still be good. So I'm kind of changing the shape a little bit, tidying that up to add those feathers in, and I'll show you what it looks like if you were to just have the feathers drawn in as well. Okay. So I'm starting to use more of my tools now, and you see I gave you some kind of funny tools. These might be good for adding patterns and textures. So this I noticed kind of reminded me of the stripes that I see on the wings, so that's kind of a simpler way of making those details. You can also carve in with these tools a little bit, make this feel a little bit more 3D, like there's spaces between the feathers. So it's really time to think about details and making every part of this clay piece really special and unique and beautiful. So anywhere that's smooth, you can ask yourself, do I want this to be smooth, or do I want it to have the look of feathers? Okay, there might be some tools that you can use also to create that look. You might find things in your house like a pencil or a comb or other things that could be creatively repurposed. I like the end of this golf tee for feathers also, for those shorter feathers we find on the tops of the wings. I also like this golf tee for creating an eye, so I can just poke that right through like this, or I could make kind of a bigger eye like that. I could also go back with a toothpick and do some really fine detail drawing. So this is your time to make this piece your own. I want to be careful to tuck these back in so that it will support those wings, but you can see how the more details and the more textures you add, the more interesting and unique your piece will become. All right, so once you think that you've gotten to a point where your piece is completed, you want to take one last look and kind of go around and say, okay, did I add details to the whole thing? Did I add texture to the whole thing? Do I love the way it looks as I turn the whole thing around? And you're going to look for any cracks. Like I noticed when I'm doing this that this wing is not very strong. So I'm trying to make sure to kind of press that back together, smooth these pieces together, and make sure that's going to be really strong. And then as I did that, I noticed I smoothed this area out of its textures, so I'm going to put those back in. So really touching up and making sure that it's complete. And once you do that, we're going to pack it extremely carefully in your Ziploc bag, okay? Because I want this to stay wet so that it can come back to school and I can write your name on it, hollow it out so it's not too thick, and make sure it doesn't need any kind of surgery before it goes into the kiln. So you see I'm putting this back into the bag and I'm propping the wings up so that they can dry in that way, making sure that it's going to be really safe and protected. You could even put more packing material around it. So again, a good packing material would be either newspaper crumpled up. These are coffee filters crumpled up, recycled paper, or paper towels. And then I'm kind of getting the extra air out, and I'm going to seal the bag really tightly, making sure that everything is, all the air is out and it's really sealed up tight. So after you do that, you're going to have to find a bucket or a box or something where this can be packed away safely to be transported back to the kiln, where this is going to go into that super hot oven and be cooked. So you see I've got my clay piece really protected, really packed well, and now I can put the rest of my tools away. So we've got some scrap clay, little pieces that I'm not going to be able to use, so I'm going to put those into my slip cup again, but I'm going to smooth them out so that they're paper thin first. Paper thin, and that's how we make our slip. Those are going to go back in there. It doesn't need to have water added. It's okay if it dries out again. So I'm putting all these little pieces that I can't use into that slip cup. Then the cap goes back on the slip cup. Any pieces that are large enough to use again can go back into the Ziploc bag. I've got another one over here. We don't want to waste any clay, so any extra pieces can go back in and be sealed up. And then those can get wrapped up with your tools. And then this whole bundle can come back to school. So you're going to pack this up super carefully. I can't stress that enough, that we want to make sure that this survives the trip back to school. Thanks so much, you guys. Hope you have fun.